Hi, ladies. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just another minute. I see a few people joining the Zoom. Let's give it a minute and we'll begin. How was everyone's week? If there's anything anyone wants to share about their week, we'll just give it another minute. Okay.
Malka, how's your little baby girl?
He's so good. Thanks for
Good.
asking.
And you look so beautiful.
Oh, thanks. It's
Is
delighting.
mommy home? Is mommy home yet?
No, she's there for another like 2 weeks. My father just left.
Oh,
The
how
trip,
wonderful.
yeah. So the momentum trip ended yesterday or 2 days
Right.
ago, and my father and Cece just went yesterday. So
Oh,
they
how
landed
amazing.
yesterday.
Oh,
What?
I was planning on coming to shul on Saturday to see your father. If he's not there, maybe I won't go.
Oh, you should still come. I'll be
He's
there.
always the reason. Oh, how wonderful. Oh, I'm so happy for them. Okay, great.
Yeah. So they're staying for I think another 2 weeks.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm really happy for them. Wish I could be there, but we'll be there on August.
Maytar and Ariel were on the same flight with your mom.
Oh, really?
Isn't that funny? Yeah.
That's so cute.
I know. All right, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, come. I mean, I don't want to discourage anyone to not come to Shul.
Of course,
Sorry, I shared the secret that my father won't be there. Yeah.
But it's still a good experience. Yeah, he's just the cherry on the cake.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay, I think we'll begin. Good morning, ladies. Let me clean up my. Okay, so good morning. We're continuing with Pirkei Avot, which is ethics of our fathers, as we know. And last week we began with the first Mishnah of chapter 3. So today we're going to move on to a Mishnah at the end of chapter 3. We're still in chapter 3, but we're going to look at Mishnah 17, at the end of the chapter. So I'm going to share my screen. We will open it up. And the author of this Mishnah, who is, as we will see, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. A little bit of background is that some of you may be familiar with this name because he is mentioned in the Haggadah, in the Passover Haggadah. So every year we mention his name, and that's just maybe why the name sounds familiar. He is mentioned in the Haggadah. And this is something that he said. He was actually something interesting, just a little tidbit about him. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the son of Azariah, was the youngest Jewish leader of all time. He became the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, at a very young age of 17, which is, sounds very young to us. And he took over Rabbi Gamliel. And there was some politics at the time regarding Rabbi Gamliel because Rabbi Gamliel had a very strict stance. And his position was that only Torah scholars and people with like a great erudite, learned ability should be allowed into the study hall. And obviously many people didn't agree with this position. It was very extreme and very exclusive. And so he was taken over by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was, as we just mentioned, only 17 years old. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had the opposite approach, where he invited all Jewish people, no matter your level of Torah knowledge, to come study in the main study hall in Israel. And it says that the day that he became Nasi means like the leader of the Jewish people, it says that thousands of benches were added to the study hall because this like influx of people came to study Torah. And it says that it was a very humbling experience for Rabbi Gamliel. He was actually quite depressed when he saw how many people came to learn Torah that he was prohibiting from coming to learn. He became very remorseful about his very strict stance. So we see that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a very kind and open-hearted person. He was very open-minded. He wasn't exclusive like his Rabbi Gamliel, who he took over, and he was the one who, it says, because of him, thousands of benches were added because there was this great influx of people coming to learn Torah. So that's a little bit about who he was. And also we see from the fact that he became the leader at such a young age shows how remarkable this human being was, that he became the leader of the Jewish people as a teenager. So let's go into his words, what he says. It says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. If there's no Torah, there is no derech eretz. We're going to translate derech eretz momentarily. For now, we'll say it means common decency, but we're going to go into what it really means. Im ein derech eretz, if there's no derech eretz or common decency, ein Torah, there's no Torah. We're going to pause there, and we're going to get to the second part later on in the class. Let's focus on the first line. If there's no Torah, there's no derech eretz, and if there's no derech eretz, there is no Torah. Now, what is interesting here, of course, oops, what did I just do? I meant to lower that. So what's interesting here is that the word derech eretz is one of those Hebrew terminologies that is not, it's a phrase that doesn't really mean the literal translation. It refers to something. So derech eretz, literally, if you are translating the Hebrew words the way they are translated, it would be the way of the world. Derech is the way, eretz is the land. So derech eretz literally means the way of the land, or the way of the world. But what this phrase is referring to, what derech eretz really means, is being a mensch, meaning common decency, respect, dignity, and decency for another human being. So when you say someone has derech eretz, it means that they are a mensch, really, that they respect others, they have common decency. That's how we'll translate it. And so what he's saying here is that they go together, right? You can't have Torah without derech eretz, and you can't have derech eretz, common decency, without Torah. Now, of course, which one comes first? Like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Because it seems like a catch-22, right? You can't get to derech eretz without Torah. You can't get to Torah without derech eretz. So which one comes first? And of course, the rabbis explain that it's not really about which comes first. It's more trying to bring out a point that they go together. You cannot have one without the other. They have to go together. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so that I can see everyone's. It's a little easier for me to teach when I can see everyone's faces. And we'll reshare the screen when we get back to the Mishnah. So here we have this phrase: you cannot have Torah without derech eretz, without common decency, and you cannot have common decency without Torah. They go together. You can't have one without the other. Now, what's going on here? Because what seems to be is that Torah is this high ideal, right? Not everybody can acquire Torah. Torah knowledge, Torah understanding takes effort. You need to learn. Torah is so vast and so deep, right? So in order to attain or acquire Torah, you really need to, commit yourself to learning, to studying, and practicing, right? But decency is something that most people have, right? It's something quite common decency, of course. Like, every person has a sense of common decency. Like, unless someone is, God forbid, an evil person, most people have decency. So why is it that these two things go together? One of them, which is Torah, seems like this big, challenging, high or ideal that, you have to work and struggle to achieve. And one seems like something that most of us have, which is decency, So they don't really seem to go together at first glance, of course. So what does it mean that one cannot exist without the other? So first of all, what is Torah? We know, and we've discussed this concept before, that the Torah is more than a set of rules, of course. The Torah, it says, is the blueprint of creation, meaning God gave us the Torah as a map for our life, as something that it's like a user manual, right? When you order a piece of furniture online, let's say you order a bookshelf, it doesn't come as a bookshelf. It comes with a bunch of planks of wood, and then it has a user manual that teaches you how to put it together, right? If you were to receive something in the mail that had no instructions, you would perhaps be confused. What do I do with this? And the same thing goes to life, right? God doesn't just place a person on this earth and say, go figure it out. God gives us a user manual for life, and that is the Torah. He says, here, this is life. These are your circumstances, and I'm not leaving you alone. I'm not asking you to figure it out on your own. I'm giving you a user manual, and that is the Torah. I'm giving you a guide. I'm giving you a way in which I'm giving you values and ethics to live your life by. And so the Torah is compared to the blueprint of the world. That God, it says that the Torah preceded the world, right? It's not that God created the world and then wrote the Torah. It actually says that the Torah preceded the world because first God had this Torah, and then he created the world based on the blueprint of the Torah. And so when God put Adam and Eve, when God put human beings on this earth, he had a Torah, a guide to give them direction. And so when we have the Torah, What it means to have Torah, when it says, if you don't have Torah, you can't have derech eretz, what does it mean to have Torah? Our rabbis explain having Torah means that you have an understanding that morals and ethics and values are not self-determined. They are determined by God. They are determined by a higher power, right? Morality is not subjective. It is given to us. It is legislated by God, by a higher power. We as human beings with flaws and with limitations, we do not determine morality. God determines morality. And that's what the Torah, that's what it means to have Torah, to have an understanding that God places us here for a purpose, and that there are Torah values and Torah morality that guides our lives. And now, what is derech eretz? What is decency, common decency, as we loosely translate it? So, derech eretz is having the ability to respect others based on these morals that God gave us in the Torah. And that's why Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says to us, you cannot have Torah, you cannot have derech eretz without Torah. Why? Because what the deeper explanation here is that in order for a person to be a decent person, to have common decency as we translated it, you must have a set of values and a set of ethics that come from a higher power. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe once explained this Mishnah, and he gave a powerful example, a sad example, of course. But the example that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave, and he said, our generation has seen this phenomenon, unfortunately, in such a clear way, and yet it's so hard to internalize, right? What phenomenon have we seen, at least from our grandparents or great-grandparents, and that is the Holocaust, right? Nazi Germany. Prior to the war, right? Germans were a very enlightened, sophisticated society. And you can even say they were very decent, right? They were people that excelled in the arts, in culture, in music, in philosophy. The Germans were very sophisticated. They were very noble. Jews in Germany were able to attend university before any other country in Eastern Europe, before Russia, before Poland, meaning Jews living in Germany prior to the war were very secularized, very assimilated. They were able to attend universities. They were able to be high up in their careers and in their positions because the Germans were decent and they were sophisticated and they were modern. The Germans were one of the first countries in Europe to introduce this idea of animal rights. Interestingly enough, I once read that in the 1930s, in Germany, a person could get fined or even jailed for torturing an animal. For torturing a dog, a person could get fined in the 1930s in Germany. And yet, the Germans were able to get to this place where they systematically mass murdered men, women, and children, 6 million of us. And so how did this cultured and sophisticated, and one can even say decent society stoop to this level where they came to a place where they were able to murder, not just by accident, systematically murder 6 million Jews? And not just Jews, handicapped people, people of color, anyone that they did not deem as human. And so how did this happen? And the answer is that the Germans had decency without morality. When morality dictated by God. When a person comes up with their own code of morality, it's a very slippery slope because there's no objective level of morality. It's whatever I deem is decent, that's what decency is, right? Or that's what morality is. And at first, this may seem okay, like, as human beings, we have an inner sense of what is right and wrong. So maybe we can come up with what is right and wrong. And the answer here, and we see this clearly displayed in Nazi Germany, is that when a person does not or when a society, I will say, does not follow a code of morality that comes from above, that comes from a higher power, it can fall. It's a very slippery slope, and it can end up where the Nazis ended up, because our human mind can literally rationalize anything, right? What did the Germans do? They rationalized the idea that killing Jews was actually an ideal. It was actually a good thing because Jews were vermin. And they came up with all of these rationalizations that for them, killing Jews wasn't seen as an immoral thing. It was seen as a good thing. It was seen as an ideal. And so we see that the human mind, there's this whole debate in psychology. I remember learning this in school, that um, there's a whole debate, and many studies were done on this. Were the Germans, right? The Germans were a whole society. Like we said, they were very cultured, they were very sophisticated. And there's this whole debate that many psychologists discussed and did studies to discover what was it that drove them to this low place. Were they innately evil people, right? Was this just a society of evil people? Or were they regular human beings that through brainwashing and through rationalization were able to come to a place where they convinced themselves that what they were doing was okay? And they did many studies on this. The Zimbardo Experiment, if anyone heard of it, where they took two groups of people and they said, you guys are the like the captors, and this group is the captives. And they watched it to see if like the average college student would become like torment their friend. Or if anyone has ever seen the movie The Wave, where a teacher did this experiment. She said half the class are the officers and the other half of the class is like the captives. And the officers, like the ones in charge, are able to do whatever they want to the other half of the class. And it's a really interesting movie that shows this this human flaw, that when a person is put in a position of power, they're able to rationalize even something as horrible as harming another human being. And so the depth of this Mishnah is really this concept that without Torah, without a guide of morality that comes from above, that comes from heaven, that comes from a higher power, that is not dictated by human beings, there is no decency, right? And even if you say, oh, this society doesn't have a guide of morality from God, but they're a decent society, it's only a matter of time before they can stoop to a level as low as Nazi Germany. Because like we mentioned before, the Nazis, or Germany prior to the war, was a decent society. They had universities and they had arts and music and all of these sophisticated things in their society. And yet they were lacking morals. And when people come up with their own guide of morality, we can rationalize anything. And I think we see this in our world today, right? We live in a world, unfortunately, where many people look down on religion and they see it as archaic, or something that is just unnecessary. And they say we can come up with our own morality. We can decide what is right and what is wrong on our own without guidance from God. And we see that with that mentality, there really is no decency. People can stoop to such a low level because our minds can rationalize things that are just utterly inhumane and utterly immoral. But we can come to a place where we convince ourselves that those things are actually compassionate or good. And, without guidance from above, it's a very slippery slope, because we cannot be the ones to determine what is right and wrong, what is moral and immoral. We have a guide from above. What's interesting is, like, even in this country, right, we have parts of this country where, some people put down religion, like I was saying, and they think that we don't need belief in God to run a society. And we see around the world that there are societies that don't necessarily have this foundation of belief in God. And they're fine taking away people's rights, taking away, even taking the life of a human being, because if you don't believe that God gave every human being life and you don't value human life because it comes from God, you can rationalize, right? This person doesn't deserve to live because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what the Nazis did. They said the Jews don't deserve to live. They gave a whole list of reasons, right? Hitler wrote an entire book on why the Jews deserve to be killed. They should be annihilated. And unfortunately, in a society that doesn't have a foundation of trusting God, that's what happens. And so, it's interesting to note that, like, who determines what is right and wrong? Like, why do we may think that, human beings have an internal compass of morality, right? We have this internal understanding of what's right and wrong. And that may be true, and it is true. But I want to pose this idea, and I want to hear your thoughts, of course. But in my understanding, I see it that, and based on this mission, of course, I see it that our internal monitor of what is right and wrong, like when we hear something that is horrific, we feel that that is evil and that is wrong. And when we see something good, we feel that person did something good. I want to argue that that internal monitor and the morality of the world stems from the Torah, stems from God, right? Because if we look at societies in the past, or even societies that exist nowadays that don't believe in a God, that don't believe in a higher power, we see that they rationalize things that are evil, that are quite literally evil. And we see, in the past, it was very normal for one country to take over another and just kill or annihilate the people in the country. And that is because it's survival of the fittest, right? I'm stronger, you're threatening me, I have the right to take your life or take your rights. And that comes from decency without Torah, which really is not decent at all. When a person does not have morality that comes from God, or when a society doesn't have a sense of a guide of ethics and morals that come from a higher power, they can stoop very low. And I want to hear your thoughts, because this could be a controversial idea, that all morality really stems from God. And without Torah values, without morality that comes from a higher power, there really is no morals, there really is no decency. If anyone has something to respond to that, I would love to hear it, because it may be a controversial idea. That we human beings are not the ones who get to decide what is right and wrong, right? Fern?
I was just going to say that, even Orthodox Jewish philosophers who teach philosophy, if you read the philosophers, whether they have been Christian or Jewish, I think most of them agree, except for the ones that totally disagree, that there is a universal order to our universe, and that is compatible with Torah. In other words, the precepts of natural philosophy, natural nature, okay, in the universe is compatible with Torah. So even if you were questioning the existence of God, the world was created without that input, and those things are compatible. Torah is the best guide to live through and experience the natural precepts of our universe, because the universe was created by God. So
exactly. So what Fern is saying, I think, is basically clarifying exactly this idea that we do have an internal monitor of morality, of like what is wrong and what is right, this like natural feeling of like this is wrong and this is right. But what this mission is teaching us is that where does that natural, like Fern used the word natural, like this natural feeling or concept of what is right and wrong come from? It comes from God. And when we decide, you know what, I'm going to veer from that, because I rationalized with my human intellect that something is right and something is wrong, that will not last, because morality has to be anchored in Torah. And Tali, we're going to get to you in one moment. I just want to finish this point that, like, in the, there is this idea, let's say, that human beings come from animals, right? Like that we stem from apes, right? And if we look at the animal world, that's how it works. There's survival of the fittest, right? If one animal is threatened by another, they kill the other animal. Or one animal wants to, for their own desire to eat, let's say, in the wild, when you go to safari, one of the coolest things that people try to see is like a kill, like when a lion attacks another animal, because for the lion to eat, that's what it is allowed to do. So if we like degrade our human existence to that of animals and say, we stem from apes and we can live with this concept of survival of the fittest, that's how you get to a place where the Nazis got to, where they felt that it was their right and their duty to annihilate an entire group of people, because that view is not anchored in Torah morality that stems from God. And it doesn't only apply to things as extreme as the Holocaust, right? There are other areas in our life, right? God gave us 613 commandments, but I don't know if everyone knows this, but there are also the 7 Noahide laws. What are the 7 Noahide laws? 7 laws which are really the basis of all morality for the entire world. Like Fern was saying, the world was created based on these guidelines of morality that God created, not human beings, but God. And the 7 Noahide laws are things like do not kill, do not steal. And these do not only apply, right? The 10 commandments are specifically for the Jewish people. Keep Shabbat, honor your parents. But the 7 Noahide laws were given to the entire humanity. Do not kill, do not steal, forbidden relationships, right? Immoral relationships are part of that. Torturing animals is part of that. One of the 7 Noahide laws is the prohibition to harm and torture an animal. One of them is having a legal system, right? That there's no anarchy, that there should be a guide of, legality, that if someone harms someone else, they can be taken to court and be judged for that. So 7 Noahide laws are something that apply to all of humanity. And those are like the basis of morality that specifically come from God. Yes, Tali.
Well, I think let me see if I'm unmuted.
You're not muted. We hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, I hear you.
What I was going to say is that that Germany at that particular time in history, it's different because those individuals at the same time, which still always amazes, had compartmentalized Jews because they were church-going people. Somehow they could walk in and go into their churches of their faith, and still in their mindset, they were living a moral existence because they were in their own, they put us in a box, which you said that we were less than animals. So they were so brainwashed to that belief, but they would go and live in another totally, the culture didn't stop. They were still living their lives, but they put us in a place that we were not human. I mean,
Right.
Only to do that, but they were still living this life that they thought was morality because there were priests, there were pastors. Right. This existed in the world. So to say they gave, I think this is a phenomenon that will never stand in history. That to do something like this, I don't know where this is repeated, but if you look at unfortunately, all our persecution throughout history, were countries that still had a very strong, the Catholicism was, whatever the religion of that country was very strong, going back to Spain, etc. So, but we were always put in this box. So
that's the point. That anti-Semitism persisted even amongst religions that, let's say believed in the sanctity of human life, like let's say Christianity. Not that I'm knowledgeable in it, but I understand your point, Tali. That's true. And of course, I bring Nazi Germany as an extreme example, but it shows, I think Tali's point actually strengthens this concept that even a society that, let's say, believes in a higher power, what we're trying to say here is that the morality that comes from the Torah, right? The Torah teaches us that every human life is valuable. There is absolutely no justification for a life not being valuable. The Torah prohibits even, somebody who is a vegetable, right? God forbid somebody who's in an accident and they're on life support. The Torah forbids you to pull them off of life support, because who is to determine which life is more valuable than the other? Every single life in the Torah is valuable, and we do not get to determine which life is more valuable than the other. And so, because I guess, the Nazis didn't have this basis of every life is valuable, it does not matter who, what, where, when, they were able to say, these groups of people, their lives don't matter. And what we see from the 7 Noahide laws is that taking the life of anyone or anything is immoral, and it doesn't across the board. And so this is, back to our Mishnah, what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is teaching us, that without Torah, there is no decency, and a society will only go downhill if it does not have an anchor in morality. More specifically, morality that is legislated by God and by the Torah values. Now, the second part of the Mishnah is the converse, right? If there is no decency, there is no Torah. And this is another phenomenon where somebody, let's say, who devotes themselves only to religious fervor, only to the Torah or Torah learning or religiosity, and they disregard decency to their fellow human being, that Torah, the Torah that they're committing themselves to, or the religion that they're committing themselves to, is not sustainable. It will not last, because we know that the Torah, the purpose of the Torah is to refine our character. And so if a person is unrefined and they do not respect their fellow human, even if they disguise themselves or act in a religious way in other areas, that Torah that they have learned or that they are following will not sustain itself. It will not last, because it says, the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? If you don't practice a skill, you're going to lose the skill. So if a person is learning Torah, but they're not putting it into practice, they're not putting into practice the lessons that the Torah teaches us, that Torah learning will not last. It will fall away. And that's why it says, if one does not have human decency, common decency, that person cannot have Torah. There's a story of the Baal Shem Tov, who we've discussed multiple times, the founder of the Hasidic movement. There was a custom of Hasidim, followers of different Rebbes, to go and visit their Rebbe and give them a report of what they've been up to. And so one time, a man came to the Baal Shem Tov to meet him and say he wanted to deliver this good news. And he said, Rebbe, this year I went through the entire Talmud. And the Baal Shem Tov answered him, you went through the whole Talmud, but how much of the Talmud went through you? Which, what he was saying is that you can learn the Torah as, looking at it from an outside perspective. But if you are not internalizing the messages of the Torah, that Torah is not gonna last. It doesn't exist, because the purpose of Torah is not just an intellectual pursuit, as we've been discussing this whole time, right? The Torah is not an intellectual pursuit. It's not another subject like science or mathematics or philosophy. The Torah is here to give us practical guidance, to give us practical morality, to give us human common decency. And if the Torah doesn't give us that, then we're learning it wrong. Then we're taking the wrong approach. We're going through the Torah instead of allowing the Torah to go through us and to become part of the way we act, to become part of who we are. And so here we see how they go together, hand in hand. Without Torah, there is no decency. Without morality that comes from God, there is no decency. Even if it starts out decent, like Nazi Germany, eventually it is a slippery slope that will not end well, because morality must be dictated by God and not by us human beings who have the ability to rationalize anything. And on the other hand, without decency, there is no Torah. Somebody cannot be a truly Torah Jew without being a decent person, without having respect and dignity for their fellow human. So they must go hand in hand. And an example of this, unfortunately, would be people who people who, under the disguise of religion, harm another person or harm, there are very extremist groups in every religion, right? We know Christianity has a history of hurting Jews, even, Muslim extremists, and even extremists in the Jewish world, right? People that, under the disguise of religion, go and harm another person, that religion is not real. That religion is not, it's not true belief and faith in God, because one cannot have Torah, one cannot have belief in God or religion or Torah without decency. They must go together. I'm just going to fix my screen. Something has happened. Okay. So let's share my screen and go into the second part of this Mishnah that we skipped out. So the second part of the Mishnah reads as follows: Im ein chachma ein yira. If there is no wisdom, there is no yira. Again, yira is a word that is loosely translated as fear of God, but we're going to explain in depth what it really means. Im ein yira ein chachma. If there's no fear of God, there is no wisdom. Now, what is yira? What does it mean, fear of God? Now, the word yira has been loosely translated as fear. But what does that really mean? Because does God want us to fear him? Fear itself is it's a very base instinct, right? You fear a wild dog that's chasing after you, or you fear, God forbid, a gunman or somebody that you feel is threatening your life, right? That's a fear that just like overwhelms you, takes over you. It's a very base instinct. It's not something that, I don't think it's something that that God wants us to feel towards him. So what does it mean, fear of God? And the word yira really shouldn't be translated as fear. A better word would be awe. Awe or reverence towards God, right? God doesn't want us to fear him in the way we fear something that we feel is threatening us. He wants us to feel awe. And that's why yira is actually a positive thing. It's not supposed to be negative. It's not supposed to be, a negative motivation to serving God. Like, I'm serving God because I'm afraid of him. That's not a good thing. Yirat Hashem, fear of God, comes from an understanding of the greatness of God. And that brings to a feeling of awe and amazement at how amazing and awesome God is. And it brings to motivation to serve him. A good example of this, I think, is when somebody is doing something, whether it's, a job or a certain pursuit, any pursuit that a person does, that they feel the magnitude of how important this is, right? Let's say a parent, I'm just going to give an easy example of a mother, right? When you parent a child, if you have the chachma, right, the wisdom to understand the depth of how impressionable a child is, there's a certain level of fear of messing up, because you understand the magnitude of how impressionable and malleable a child is, how every little thing can affect them in a way, for the positive or the negative. And it brings to, I don't know what word to use, but not really fear, but it's like a mixture of fear and awe of like, I internalized how important this task is, and I approach it with a sense of awe. I don't, look at it as something unimportant. It's something extremely important. The Rebbe once gave an example of raising children, of chinuch, which is the Hebrew word for educating a child. And the Rebbe brought out how powerful chinuch, which is educating children, is. He said, if someone were to take a small seed, right, and make a scratch or a dent or a cut in the seed, and then they tried to plant the seed, the flower or whatever plant they were trying to plant, to grow, would grow flawed, right? Either it wouldn't grow properly at all, or if it grew, it would grow flawed because you made a dent, you made a cut in the seed, which is the most, it's like the concentrated, most impactable part of the flower or the tree, let's say. Now, if a person were to make a scratch in the trunk of a tree, a full-grown tree, the impact would be minimal, right? You wouldn't damage or harm the tree at all by just making a scratch in the trunk, because it's a full-grown tree. But when a person makes a scratch in a seed, that seed, you're debilitating it and not allowing it to grow properly. And the Rebbe said this is the same thing as raising children. An adult is not as impressionable as a child. So if someone makes a scratch in an adult, right, most healthy adults will not be deeply, terribly affected forevermore. But a child, when there's a dent or a scratch in raising of a child, God forbid, right? A child is so impressionable that children can carry that damage with them, that trauma with them for the rest of their life, because they're at such a delicate moment, and so, or time in their life. And so when a parent really contemplates that idea, they approach parenting their child with a deep reverence, with a deep awe of the powerful, impactful position that they are in. And that fear, I don't want to call it fear, but that awe only comes from chachma, from wisdom, from understanding the depth of what you're doing. And it's a positive thing, right? If someone were to embark on a certain pursuit that they felt had no meaning, right? No one cared if you failed or succeeded. There's very little motivation. There's very, very little joy in what you're doing. A parent feels this joy in parenting their child because they understand the depth and the impact that they can have on their child. And that's a good thing, right? It's not, we have to use it for good. It's not to make you scared and apprehensive. It's not a fear that holds you back. It's a fear that motivates you, right? That's the difference. It's not fear, like fight, flight, or freeze, right? When someone feels fear, they freeze. So fear is debilitating, but yira is not fear that holds you back. It's fear that motivates you. It's awe, it's reverence, it's amazement, right? When someone is amazed by the amazing gift that God gave them. God gave me this child and I have this amazing mission, awesome, like almost scary mission of raising my child to be the best person that they can be. That is so motivating because it's such a big job. And so the same thing applies for our relationship with God. When we understand, right, the understanding is chachma, wisdom. When we have the wisdom to understand the magnitude of our relationship with God, of fulfilling the mitzvot, how important it is, how impactful it is, we approach it with this yira, with like this awe. I'm in awe of the amazing job that I was given to be able to be in this relationship with God. And that's like, the same way, I'll give another example of this, if a person were to, eat something that God forbid was like spoiled or had poison, some kind of poison in it that would be detrimental to their health, let's say, that person is like fearful of eating that food. Why? Because they fear for their health, right? You're not going to eat something that is harmful for you because you value your health. And the flip side of this, the example I'm trying to give is, let's say with kosher or any mitzvah, really, if we understand the effect that, let's say, non-kosher food would have on our soul or on our relationship with God, the spiritual effect of, let's say, something that's not kosher, we would be in awe, the same way we are like afraid to touch food that could be detrimental to our health. we should have that same like fear of eating something that could be detrimental to our spiritual health. And so this is why the Mishnah says, without chachma, there is no yira. Without understanding the magnitude of how important our relationship with God is, there is no yira. There is no awe of God. But on the other hand, without yira, without this awe and fear of God, there is no chachma. What does that mean? So there's a higher level of yira, of awe of God, that comes from understanding that our minds are limited and we cannot understand the full ways of God. We can never understand God in his entirety because God is unlimited and God is omnipresent and we are limited. Our minds are limited. So there's no way that our human intellect can fully grasp godliness. And when a person comes to that realization that even though I have this awe of God, part of that awe stems from an understanding that I will never truly understand the depth of who God is, of the way he runs his world. And that brings a certain level of humility, but also wisdom, because you're not presumptuous to think that you understand everything or that you know all of God's ways, because we don't. We're limited. If we understood everything God did, then he wouldn't be God. The fact is that we are only human and we are creations of God. And so we can't understand all of God's ways. And so that fear is a higher level of awe. It's an awe that comes from, I am not capable of understanding the depth of who God is and the way he runs his world. And so it's a deeper level of awe and it's a deeper level of wisdom. And that's why we say in this Mishnah that these two things also go together, right? Wisdom and fear. Because yira, I don't like using the word fear, it's really yira. Sometimes in Hebrew, one Hebrew word needs like an entire English sentence to explain it, because Hebrew is, the holy language. And so each word in Hebrew has so much depth and so much meaning, and it's very hard to use one English word to translate it. As we see that we're always like loosely translating a term and then explaining it deeper, because that's how the Hebrew language works. Every term has a lot of depth. So really yirat Hashem, the awe or fear of God, comes from a deep understanding, a deep chachma. We've discussed this before, but what is chachma? What is wisdom? So the word chachma in the Zohar is explained to mean not just an understanding of like, I have a certain amount of knowledge. Wisdom, chachma specifically, is compared to a flash of lightning. When you're walking in a dark night and all of a sudden the sky is illuminated by a flash of lightning, there's like that moment of clarity, that moment of like an epiphany. It's like this, in the midst of your fog, there's this moment of clarity. And that's what chachma is. Chachma is like, we've discussed this before, chachma is like that light bulb moment, right? When you're in a confusing or uncertain situation and you have this epiphany or this moment of clarity, that's chachma. That's like a chachma moment. It's when you have a flash of understanding. It's chachma is also compared to re'iyah, which is seeing, because you have this clarity and this foresight. And so chachma is really, or having chachma that leads to yira, is when we're living in this world that could be foggy and could be confusing, and we have this flash of chachma of like, God runs the world and God is with me in every moment, and I understand the magnitude of my relationship with God and the Torah. That like flash of understanding, that clarity, leads to yira, which is awe, because I'm in awe of my new understanding of who God is. So if anyone has questions based on this, we can discuss now. But this Mishnah actually continues to say that there's actually two other, I didn't think we would have time for it, but there's actually two more points to this Mishnah where he says, without Torah, there is no sustenance. Without sustenance, there is no Torah. So really what Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah is doing in this Mishnah is he's taking things that cannot exist. They must exist together. They cannot exist without one another. And the two things we spoke about today were Derech Eretz and Torah, and wisdom and fear, wisdom and awe of God. So if anyone has, I think let's open up for discussion. If anyone has ideas or thoughts that they would like to share based on this, I would love to hear your thoughts. But this is really what Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah is teaching us in this Mishnah. And it's beautiful to note what we said in the beginning, that he was the one who opened the study hall to all people. And he said, every Jew can access Torah in their own way, on their own level. And he took down the exclusivity of Torah learning. And he said, Torah is for everyone. And so may that inspire and teach us all to pursue Torah on our own level. And that's really what all of you ladies do every week by joining these Torah classes. So I really appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, we can discuss now. But with that, we will conclude. Thank you, ladies, for logging on. I appreciate all of you for joining. And I'm happy to stay on to discuss any topic or any questions that you had on today's lesson. But otherwise, thank you all for joining. Joy, you have something to share?
Yes, I wanted to go back to the beginning and what you talked about with Nazi Germany and all that. And I was thinking that there's a much closer to home. I mean, that's plenty close to home, too close to home, but in our own country in very recent months, and that's with the COVID-19 pandemic. And, when there was all this, before people knew that, whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, you have an equal chance of getting it and giving it to other people. Before they knew that, there were people on social media that said, they want to kill all the unvaccinated people because they were feeling threatened that their health, was in jeopardy, and we should go out and systematically kill all these people. And that I know that's stemming from fear and feeling threatened and not having any faith in God and not having your morality come from God. But the morality was just twisted so quickly and so easily with something like that. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Thank you, Joy, for your understanding of what we discussed today. I think I don't want to go into like politics or things like that. I feel like there are a lot of examples in our modern day society. The Holocaust was, a good extreme example of this. And it's hard in today's society because there's, things could get so political, but there are definitely examples of, thank God we live in a country that was founded on a belief in God. Every dollar bill says in God we trust. And so the base of America, thank God we live in a country where God is or should be, at least ideally, is at the center of our belief system. And that's the beauty of America. The problem is when people try to, disregard the fact that God is the biggest player in who determines what is right and wrong. There's a book, I didn't read the book, but I heard about it in a lecture once, where it's a book called God is Not Great. And it's basically this, philosopher that is atheistic, and he writes about how religion only caused harm, and throughout history, religion has just been, something that caused death and harm and nonstop pain and violence, which, that's a different discussion, that religion has had, not certain religions have not had the best mark on history. Thank God, you know, we believe in a God that is merciful and compassionate, and like we spoke, the Torah believes in the value of every human life, and so the Jewish nation were always the ones being persecuted, and they never the persecutors. We were always a nation of love and compassion, and so, you know, the question to his book really is, those societies that attacked other nations, other societies, to them, let's say someone doesn't believe in, I'm not talking about any God, but I'm talking about, you know, the God that put in place the 7 Noahide laws for the entire world, the 7 laws of morality for the world, right? If we don't believe in those 7 laws, right, who is to say that that is wrong, right? Why did societies in the past do those kind of things where they attacked others and killed others? Because they believed that it was the right thing. So really, who determines that taking another life is wrong? How do you know that harming another person is the wrong thing? The only way we know that every life is valuable no matter what is because God told us that, right? And we've internalized this to the point where we feel that it is wrong to take another life or to harm or hurt another person in any way. We've internalized this to the point where we feel that it's wrong, but that original concept really does come from the Torah, really does come from God. And when we disregard the fact that it comes from God, the issue is that eventually it can be rationalized and discarded of because we've forgotten the fact that it really stems from a higher power. Yes, yeah, Fern.
I just wanted to say power is really the key word, and you've used it a lot. Because God, believing in Torah, following Torah empowers you.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, there used to be a commercial about kosher hot dogs. We believe in a higher authority. It's a way, it's a path to ignore or to fight off or to get away from that which you think is evil and immoral. Is that one thing about observing Judaism, observing Shabbat, is to get away. You get away from people, you know, from this power-hungry civilization. And it is all about power and money. Power is money, money is power. And these are individuals who feel that the top level is themselves, that human beings can be the most powerful, and therefore they can do whatever. If you don't believe in that, you believe there's a higher authority, you're not going to get to that destructive point.
That's very true, Fern. That's a very, very true point. Thank you for sharing. When we don't, I think what you're trying to say, Fern, is that when we don't believe in a higher authority and a higher power, we become our own higher power, right? We become the most important thing. So it's no longer that God determines what's right and wrong. I am the one who determines when was right and wrong. I determine what decency is. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be in. And that's, you know, some of the dangers we see happening in the world today. Like when people lose their sense of morality, it's because they have determined this new code of morality that is based on their own thoughts and ideas and not based on Torah or godly values. Yeah. It is, I hope that's like, I understood what you were saying. Yeah. And the same thing goes for, you know, raising children. Like we were mentioning before, how important and impactful it is. And, you know, raising children, just because I'm in the first stage of raising children, you know, I have a little baby, it never ends really. Like you can have an adult child and still, you're still their parent. And the role of a parent in Judaism, of course, is to shelter and keep your child safe and healthy and all of those, you know, practical things that a parent has the responsibility of doing. But essentially, the role of a parent in Judaism is to impart values to your child. And as a new mom myself, I find it so, what's the word? I find it like it's such a breath of fresh air for me that I don't have to, I can't even imagine what my life as a mom would be like if I didn't have Torah values to give to my child. I was thinking about this last week. Like, if I had to come up with my own values, like if I didn't have religion or if I didn't have a belief in God and I had a child like I do, and I had to say, okay, what are the values I want to teach to my child? I would be in such a confused and lost state. Like, how does one determine which values they should teach to their child? Like, unless you have a guide, like which is the Torah, and ethics and morality that come from a higher power, like I am too limited in my intellectual understanding of the world and of our purpose in this world. I am way too limited to come up with these ideas on my own. Like, how could I determine what values to teach to my child? And of course, the answer is I can't. Like, the only way to really impart wholesome values to your child is to teach them the values of the Torah and teach them, you know, the values that God gave us, the power of human life, the importance and value of every single person, all of the 10 Commandments. And actually, that, you know, that's really the basis of the 10 Commandments. If anyone knows, the 10 Commandments were 2 tablets. The first one, the first 5 of the commandments are between man and God, and the second set of tablets is between man and man. And the explanation is exactly this point, that in order to have decency between man and man, there first must be a relationship between man and God. And that's why the first 5 of the commandments are between man and God, and the second 5 are between man and man. And the lesson here is that the foundation of human decency between human beings is a belief in God, is a trust in the values of the Torah and the 10 Commandments, really, of do not kill, do not steal, and not do not kill and do not steal and do not engage in immoral relationships, not because I came up with them or some human being came up with them, God forbid, but because God commanded us to keep these commandments. And God is the creator of the world, like you were saying before, Fern, that God created the world. And so he knows more than any person, obviously, what the moral values of this world must be. So these are the best values to impart to our children. And these are the best values, or the only values, that are worthwhile taking upon ourselves and imparting to the next generation. So with that, we will bid farewell. Thank you, ladies, for joining today's class. And we'll see you next week. I know that we might be alternating between myself, my sister Hindi, and Clara Rice. So it may be my sister next week. I have to confirm with her, but we wanted to change it up for you so it's not always the same. But it's been lovely, and I'm not sure if I'm teaching next week or my sister. That's why I'm just giving this heads up. So ladies, thank you for joining. Have a wonderful week and an early Shabbat Shalom. I hope to see whoever can make it to synagogue on Shabbat this week, and have an amazing day. Bye, ladies. Thank you all for joining. I appreciate it.